Good afternoon, everyone. We are about to start our plenary session. So today, in our plenary session of our international conference on socio-cultural dimensions of English studies, we have with us Dr. Nicholas Birns from New York University, US. Sir is right now working as an adjunct professor at New York University, USA. Nicholas Birns is a scholar of literature, including fantasy and Australian literature. As a Tolkienian scholar, he has written on a variety of topics, including the scoring of the Shire and Tolkien's biblical sources. His analysis of the writings of Anthony Powell and Roberto Bellino has been admired by scholars. Sir took his BA at Columbia University in 1888. He took his MA at the New York University and completed his PhD degree as well from the same university. Sir was a visiting professor at Western Connecticut State University and also joined Eugene Long College and teaching many different courses in the literature. He taught at the College of New Rochelle, at the College of New as well, and now Sir is working as an adjunct professor at New York University, USA. He is also the editor of Antipodes, a global journal of Australian and New Zealand literature. Now we would like to have our expert session on online mode. So I request to the technical team to connect us with the Sir. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and many thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there with you, and I'm sorry that due to time differences, I couldn't give this talk synchronously and do a Q&A. However, I am shortly going to share with you my email address, and you could be in contact with me, and certainly feel free to ask me any questions or give any response to my talk. I want to thank the organizers of this conference, particularly Dr. Arjun Devi, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. My topic is the rather broad one of literature and society. And I am not going to attempt to answer this very comprehensive question, but I am going to give you some idea of what my thoughts are on the subject. I'm just going to share my screen to give you a very, very general outline of what I plan to do today. And that screen will also have my email address, and you can see it right there. My email address is up there, Nicholas Birns, B-I-R-N-S. My email address is nb2003@NYU.edu for New York University. And literature and society, I'm going to talk about three aspects: communicability, sociality, and elasticity. I'm going to put this document back on at the end of my talk so you can transcribe the email address again. And now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and proceed to the main aspect of my talk. My first aspect is communicability. Literature, when we think of literature, we usually think of poetry, of drama, of more recently prose fiction, of imaginative literature. We largely think of literature as creative. There are aspects of nonfiction, history, philosophy, letters, diaries, biography, autobiography. Those genres can also be literature. But I would say everything in writing is not literature. The average record, the average written record is not literature. Sometimes, though, when that average written record is very early, it can be literature. For instance, the first document recorded in any language conceivable as a version of French, of modern day French, was the Sermons de Strasbourg, the Odes of Strasbourg, which are the first document which can be said to be in French and not in late Latin, to be in that middle language of French and not the high language, the liturgical language of Latin. And that is important for historians of the language because it's the first document in the history of that language. And so it has an importance analytically that it wouldn't on its own terms. But usually when we talk about literature, we are talking about those things which are written down, which have more than a transactional importance, which you could look at later for their style or their content or their historical role, which literature is something that bears more than one reading. And when we think about the relation of writing, which can bear more than one reading, and its relation to society, you go back into the question of communicability. There are some societies which until very recently expressed themselves totally in oral terms and had no written communication. Polynesia, indigenous Australia, some peoples in what is now Latin America, some peoples in Africa. This did not mean that they did not have signifying systems. It did not mean they did not have language or a means of representation or notating that language. It means they did not have a writing as it has been historically defined. And those cultures, as they came into contact with the Islamic world, or with the Western world, or with the East Asian world revolving around China and Japan, those traditions all had long established modes of literacy. And as the predominantly oral cultures came into contact, they also adopted those modes of literacy, so that literacy in writing, and therefore literature, is available to people worldwide. Those traditions that have had writing for a long time go back ultimately to four civilizations circa 3000 BCE that separately, although with cumulative mutual influence as time went on, it invented writing as a mode of notation and later on as an expression of meaning. Those were ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq, the Indus Valley, in what is now India and Pakistan, and ancient China, the Huanghe and Yangtze valleys, which are the core of what later became China. And in those four regions, there was very early on a literature, something which was written. Something one notices, though, if you go to the earliest documents in any of those traditions, you all know the two great ancient Indian epics, the epics written in Sanskrit, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. There also are in ancient Greece, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and in the Near East, the writings that are now called the Hebrew Bible, that Christians call the Old Testament. And if you look at all of these bodies of writing, they are transcribed, they are written down very early in the tradition, but it is thought, are all codifications of oral tradition, of tradition which goes back even before the written form. Certainly, I'm just teaching the Iliad right now. People think that with Homer and with the ancient Greek epics, that the writing down of the story was fairly late in the compositional process. And so these foundational works of literary tradition all have an orality behind them. And so when one speaks of communicability, you have to keep two very important and somewhat contradictory points in mind. One is certainly it's very important that these texts are written down, because how we react to them, the fact that they can be reproduced, the fact that they can be archived, all has to do with the fact that they are written down. And that is the way that these texts last, that people don't have to hand them on person to person. This was, of course, before recording technology. Now that we have recording technology, it's very different. People can listen to audiobooks. Literature can have what Walter Ong, the critic Walter Ong, called a secondary orality, the idea of secondary orality. that the in recording and in the media universe, just putting his name in the chat, Walter Ong, who was actually a Catholic priest, a Jesuit priest, Walter Ong, S.J., and he talked about, he was very influenced by Marshall McLuhan, the media theorist, and he talked about secondary orality. And we have all sorts of secondary orality today in writing and in expression. But until the invention of recording technology, we only had writing and speaking. And it's very important that the written is written. And if people are familiar with Jacques Derrida, with post-structuralism, the emphasis on the graphemic nature of writing, and that writing has its own meaning as writing and is not simply, as Plato famously had his dialogists talk in the symposium about, or in the Phaedrus about, that it is not just inferior to spoken expression. And that's all, I understand. I'm an exponent of that kind of thinking. On the other hand, we cannot discount orality and that residual presence of orality in communicability, which, if you're talking about literature and society, how do people know literature? How do people get acquainted with literature? And before we talk about literature's social role or what literature means in social terms, we have to think about how do people understand literature? And until recently, very few people worldwide have been able to read and write. The development of mass literacy in all global society is relatively recent. And so it's very important to understand that literature comes out of this much broader oral dimension, and that texts, like these early texts I mentioned, something like the Iliad, even though its authority and meaning is written, the power that lies behind it is oral. And this is true of these very early texts, but I would say it is true of much literature. Shakespeare in English literature. Of course, we could see Shakespeare performed, but it is also, you could read the text. And when Shakespeare wrote his plays, he wrote them to be performed, but he also wrote them. But even if we don't see the plays, even if we just read Hamlet, for instance, the fact that that play is written out of a kind of oral basis, that it is in very close contact with orality, really helps contribute not just to the means of its communicability, but to the richness of the language. And one of the reasons, if you look, and I will just confine myself to the Western tradition now, but if you look at something like the Bible, the Iliad, Shakespeare, the strength of all of those texts lies in how they are on the border between orality and literacy. And when you look at certain post-colonial texts, when you look at texts today from Africa, from the Caribbean, I think they also gain their power from that contact with oral tradition. I would indeed say that even very sophisticated works that we do not think of in connection with orality or with storytelling, thrive because of that contact. A writer like Marcel Proust, the great French writer of the early 20th century, famed for his 7-novel sequence, À la recherche du temps perdu, In Search of Lost Time, a remembrance of things past. That is, as those of you who have read know, a very philosophical text. It is a very subtle text. It is also a text about a very refined modern society, which is very different from the world of the Iliad, which is about warfare and the honor of warriors. It's a very different setting, even though, of course, there is war also in Proust, as those of you who have read it know. But the fact that that novel has a narrator and the story is being told through the presence of this narrator who talks to us, who gestures to us orally and who makes it feel like a conversation, a very subtle conversation, a very refined conversation, but nonetheless a conversation. That is very important to the success of Proust. A writer Proust very much admired, George Eliot. I'm sure some of you know George Eliot in Middlemarch. The way she has that narrator, who is an omniscient narrator in one sense, but in another sense has very particular opinions and is always giving advice and making generalizations that are meaningful and that are opinionated. That has a residue of orality in it. And in literature, the voice is never entirely still. And you see this in drama, of course, when people are speaking in different ways, and in poetry. I mean, again, something like John Milton's Paradise Lost. I'm sure some of you know that text. And John Milton was an extremely learned, bookish, educated man. He was perhaps the most educated person that Great Britain ever produced, at least in terms of humanistic terms. But that text has an incredible orality to it. And of course, as you know, he composed the last parts of it while blind, while he couldn't see. And the poem has this orality. A colleague of mine who has studied Caribbean literature also teaches Paradise Lost, and she spends a large part of her class simply reading the poem aloud because it has this orality in it. And yes, there are all sorts of ideas in the poem which can be talked about in intellectual analytic terms, which I very much encourage doing. It's very appropriate to read somebody like Milton analytically, but it's crucial to understand that the poem would not exist without this oral component. So in terms of communicability, yes, people know how to read and write much more worldwide now, and that's good. But a lot of the power of literature to me has to do with hearing that voice within and hearing that contact with orality. And I would also say that in terms of literature's importance in the larger society, that importance of books where people haven't read them, but they know what's in it. So in the United States, one of the great American novels is Moby Dick by Herman Melville, the great novel about a pursuit of a white whale by an enraged sea captain. And Moby Dick is one of the texts most frequently assigned in literature classes if you study them at an advanced level. On the other hand, it's a very hard book to read, and very few people in the United States have actually read it, even quite educated people. But everybody knows Moby Dick is a white whale, and there's seafood restaurants named after the whale. Everybody knows the story, even if they haven't read the text. A Don Quixote in the Spanish-speaking world and even here. People don't have to have read it to know that Don Quixote is somebody who kind of believes he's in a world which isn't really real. Everybody knows that. So that way that the stories of literature can be communicated beyond merely the set of people who read them or who study them professionally. That literature has that communicable dimension. I would say that it is also attributable to orality. So although we might think of the oral most immediately in conjunction with those early texts of the ancient world, or with those texts emerging from post-colonial societies where oral traditions are still vibrant, I think you could find orality in nearly any important literary text. The orality often resides in the narrative and the opinions of the narrative, and that this is a very important aspect of how literature is communicable in society and the social role that literature has. So that is the first section, orality. I'm just going to go back to my screen and look at the, and I'm going to section number 2, which I'm going to stop my screen right now. Okay, sociality. What is the difference between society and sociality? Where society is a group of people, society is an organized community. I would say the difference between society and sociality is how, given that there is this community, how people get along with each other. And in the United States, we all learn as children our Declaration of Independence when we declared independence from Great Britain in 1776. And we have a phrase in that declaration: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those are the things that, according to the Declaration of Independence, governments are instituted to preserve: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, it's fairly obvious what life and liberty are. You can define them differently in philosophical terms and in terms of your political ideology, but I think few would disagree about what they are. The pursuit of happiness, though, is often elusive. And in today's language, people think, oh, it just means being happy. It just means following one's bliss, as the late Joseph Campbell put it. I think in the 18th century, it meant more than that. It meant you're in a society and you need to promote your own welfare, but you need to do it in a way that respects the general welfare. And these are ideas that in the Western world were very much concomitant with the Enlightenment. And with, in particular, not just with the French Enlightenment, which is what people think of when they think of the Enlightenment, but the Scottish Enlightenment. And much of what we today call early sociology was from the thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment, particularly people like David Hume and Lord Keynes and George Robertson, who were early sociologists, although they didn't classify themselves that way, but they were people who thought about society. And of course, when we talk about the Enlightenment, we do have to acknowledge that the Enlightenment was not all good. For instance, the colonialism and the European subjugation of a lot of non-European nations, including India, occurred during the Enlightenment. And the social advances of the Enlightenment went hand in hand with a very exploitative and hegemonic behavior of European nations towards other nations. And in literary history and in historical history, there is never an unalloyed good. There's always that tragic element. So when I speak of the Enlightenment, I'm aware of that incongruity or that discrepancy, that you can't just speak of it as an unalloyed good. But in Western society, and in a way, part of this came from imperialism, because when you had Western society expanding and getting into contact with people whose culture they did not understand, there had to be a way to communicate with people that wasn't simply communicating with people you already knew. It was a communication across cultural borders. It was a communication of cultural encounter. Even in a society like the early US, which in 1776 was not the industrial, mechanized society it is today, but still was a society where there were hundreds of thousands of people. Not everybody knew each other. How do you get along? How do you, given that you are a society, how do you get along with each other? And the answer of the pursuit of happiness, of sociality, that you don't know each other, but you respect each other. And you develop, and here's the importance of literature, you develop a language, which is a way of communicating in writing the fact that you are aware that you are writing to people who you do not know personally, who do not live in the same community, who do not live in the same way you do, who may even, as translation became more common, may even not even speak your original language, but they are a part of your audience. And that literature as an institution has to navigate these different constituencies of sociality, and that literature ceases to be coterie literature, literature of just your pals, that literature is something wider, where you are writing to people who are not part of your in-group. That becomes very important. And that means that literature can have meaning in many different contexts, and in contexts beyond that for which it was originally intended. And when we speak of literature and society, often what people mean when they study that is, well, what does the writer have to do with the society at the time? And traditionally, for instance, with Shakespeare, that meant, what was Shakespeare's relation to the people in power at the time, particularly the English monarch, whether it be Elizabeth I or James I? How did Shakespeare get along with the king or queen? And often literature and society is reduced to, how did the writer relate to people in power? And I don't want to gainsay the importance of that, particularly since up until very recently, that's how writers were supported by patrons. And patrons were wealthy people who were either kings or princes or queens, or were very wealthy people with the power to subsidize writers. It's only recently that writers, for instance, make their living either by teaching in a university, as I do, or through selling their books to a wide public, and not needing the patronage of the prince, the king, the merchant, whoever. And so when we study writers of earlier periods, such as Shakespeare, we do have to ask those questions of how, in practical terms, did Shakespeare negotiate, in the phrase of Stephen Greenblatt, the famous Shakespearean Stephen Greenblatt, his book Shakespearean Negotiations. How did Shakespeare negotiate in those corridors of power? Of course, as time has gone on, scholars have realized that it's not just the king, or who it's. They're also, how does literature relate to the lower classes? How does literature relate to the workers? How does literature relate to people who didn't necessarily have a voice, but who certainly had a social presence? And scholarship of writers such as Shakespeare has accounted for those issues more and more. And people have looked at representations of oppressed classes in texts like that. But I would like to go even further and say that part of the sociality of a text is not just the writer's relation to the society that produced it, but the way it encounters contexts that it had not intended. Shakespeare, when he wrote, it was the very early days of English colonization. He would not have seen so many different societies where English is a language, a national language, if not necessarily the only national language. There are so many countries all over the world. There are countries, even where Britain did not have a colonial past, where English is a predominantly understood language and where there is much instruction in English. And Shakespeare did not intend that. He did not have any grasp of that. but his texts do go across those barriers, and their meaning does change. Their meaning is renegotiated. And there is a sense, and I am not saying we should never have conflict. I think conflict in literary studies is good. But there is a sense that with that sociality, there comes a respect and a politeness where you don't know my context and I don't know your context, but we could speak to each other and we could use literature to negotiate across those differences. Never really satisfactorily, never really conclusively, never really determinatively, but that negotiation is still there. And if we didn't have an agreed upon language, and conferences such as this are part of that language, the sociality of literature is expressed in things like journals, conferences, books, situations where people of different backgrounds encounter each other who will never see things the same way, but are at least trying to have the same conversation. That is something very important. And so when we speak of the social context of literature, yes, it very much matters what was the political situation of the writer at the time. But I'm also interested in how do the texts that are produced by that conjunction of writer and political situation, how are those exported in a variety of networks? And how do we negotiate the meaning of the exportation, given that we are all different people and we are all from very, very different contexts? So that is what I mean by sociality. And finally, I'm going to share my screen for my last point, which will be the longest point. And that is talking about elasticity. Elasticity. You see that on the board there. Elasticity. What do I mean by that? Elasticity is a concept that I talked about in my 2019 book, The Hyperlocal in 18th and 19th Century Literary Space. And you all know what elasticity means, when it's elastic, when you could kind of stretch it. When it's not just stuck in the shape it comes in, but you could stretch it and bend it. And this is a point where communicability, my first point was the dimensions literature has, and a lot of it is because literature has the secondary orality. Sociality, the fact that we could talk to each other outside of our specific context and negotiate those meanings. And elasticity is about literature itself changing and society in itself changing as time goes on and as there are shifts in context and background. Often when people say, I think one of the issues with the phrase literature and society, and just one of the ways I would ask you to rethink some assumptions that we have been given, is we often in that phrase see literature as something univocal and unitary, and it's one thing. And society is something as univocal and unitary and one thing. And I think we have to contest that a bit. There are many different genres of literature. There are many different writers. There are many different intentions behind literature. And we have, can popular song be literature? And I think much of what I said about that contact of orality and literacy, popular song, the fact that popular song can be literature and is touched by literature. And there are so many things that literature can be. And I'm very reluctant to exclude anything from being literature. And even if you stay within a genre like the novel, which is doing very well. The novel is doing very well as a genre in India, in Indian languages, as well as South Asian languages, as well as in English. The novel is doing very well in the US. the novel is doing very well as a genre worldwide. And I think there's general agreement on what a novel is, but the specifics of that are so different. And the way a novel communicates and reflects society is so different from writer to writer, from era to era, from speech situation, as it were, to speech situation. And we have to realize literature changes. The American poet Richard Wilbur, who died perhaps 10 years ago at a very distinguished age, he had this phrase in one of his poems. The beautiful changes. The beautiful is not just one thing. And beauty is not a constant. The sense of beauty is, but the specifics of beauty never are. Literature changes. And so does society. Society can be very plural. Society is not just one thing or one set of people, and it is not just the people in power. The late Swedish sociologist Niklas Luhmann, who is a thinker who some of you may know, I feel he's somewhat underrated as a thinker. Niklas, it's spelled not like my name, which is Cholas, but Niklas in the Swedish way, Niklas Luhmann. And he talked about the way society is something very differentiated and very complex and very plural, and that society can change. Society could never be presumed as a substrate. And so in that formula of literature and society, you have those two terms, both of which are changing, both of which are elastic, both of which can stretch, both of which are not fixed. And this comes up something which certainly in the US, literature professors are always asked to talk about these days, is identity politics and the expression of racial or gender identity in literature. And often people ask me, why are English departments talking about race and gender and sexuality? Why aren't people just talking about style and language and words? And the answer is, of course, those two things are always implicated in each other. And literature has always talked about identities. It's often in this country, white people do not like it when literature is suddenly talking about non-white identities, but that is the way that white people have talked about identity in literature for many decades. And in the United States, white people are going to have to get used to people of color and indigenous people, Black people, brown people, Latinx people, Asian diaspora people talking about their identities, because literature changes, society changes, and a lot of those writers have used writers of non-white identity in the US have used experimental forms and non-objective forms and have been disruptive linguistically, precisely to show that parallel between society changing and literature changing. So I would disagree with former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who famously said there is no such thing as society. I certainly think there is such a thing as society, but it's always changing. And in 1950 in this country, literature and society meant books about the white working class. But today it means more LGBTQ people, African Americans, Indigenous Americans, and people of color. and people who have been excluded by hegemonic identities and by white supremacist identities. And literature is today, and it should be, responsive to these identities, responsive to these social currents. And as society is changing, literature is changing. And there are many different societies at the same time. And I'm not just speaking about different ethnicities, but different ways of being social. The internet has made being social something very different. And you can be social with people you don't know and have relations with people you don't know. In the 18th century, you were, as I mentioned before, with the Enlightenment, very aware of people you don't know. But you couldn't just touch a screen and be in contact with them, and now you can. And so society is changing and literature is changing with it. And there's that elastic relation, there's that stretch, there's that redefinition that they're mutually informing each other. I would also, though, note back to the question of when people ask the average American English professor, why are you talking about race and gender and sexuality? Why does that seem to be so much a part of the profession? I think it's also notable that people who want to talk about race and gender and sexuality are turning to literature and are turning to, as I said at the very beginning, literature is not all writing communication. Literature is a very specific set of imaginative genres like poetry, fiction, drama, supplemented by nonfiction genres, which can also be literary vehicles like history, letters, diaries, biography, autobiography, philosophy. That literature is being used to express these identities, and that literature can express these identities more than any other kind of mode of representation can, and more than just straightforward polemical articulation can. And therefore, that gives the literary critic who is trained in a particular literary way, who has the very rigorous training that we've all had to have. And I and you who are listening to this talk, the training we have all had to get the credentials that we all have, or in the case of postgraduates, are on your way to getting, it's very hard. It's very rigorous. People think, oh, reading a book is easy. All you do is sit around and read books. No, it's very rigorous. It's very hard. It's very exacting. And we learn a very subtle and engaged and attentive way of looking at language. And that subtle and engaged and attentive way is very valuable in expressing matters of identity, which inevitably lead to conflict, especially as identities that have been previously oppressed or subordinated are rightfully saying it's time for us to have some visibility in this community as well. And I would not discount the way that specifically literary techniques of close scrutiny, of close reading of language, are not only still relevant, even if the subject matter seems very social, but are more relevant than ever, because that concentrated attention that literature generates is really crucial in negotiating that communicability and these social forms of respect, and is also adept at keeping on top of the elasticity that society is always changing, that literature is always changing. And it's like mathematics, where, you know, it's always exponentially, where, I mean, I never even passed a calculus class, but I know that calculus deals with speed and the way speed affects the quantity. And in a way, that's the realm we're in literature, because everything is changing and we have to gauge how language is changing in response to that. And it's never settled. And we never could stop and say, well, this is what society is. This is what literature is. There's always that elasticity that's always changing. And keeping on top of that is very hard. And it requires a lot of openness and a lot of scrutiny. And so the job we are all doing in the 21st century in negotiating these things, and I know things are different in India than in the US, but inevitably the societies are dealing with a lot of the same issues. And how we negotiate these issues testifies to how important our training is. Okay, to sum up, and I'm going to share my screen one more time. I have talked to you about three aspects, the relation of literature and society: communicability, sociality, communicability is about orality, and it's about the way literature can mean outside of that narrow group of people like us. There are not a lot of us who are studying it professionally, and that's why we teach. That's why it's meaningful to our students, because literature does have a border with that larger oral world. Literature is always telling a story, even if it's a lyric poem. If it's a lyric poem, it's still telling the story of your inner feelings. That's what great lyric poets do. And it has that communicability. Literature and society, that relation has sociality, because we have to be polite and respectful and be aware that when we talk about these issues, we're directing it into a set of people we do not know. And most importantly, literature and society as a relationship has elasticity, because there is no one, I would certainly say there is such a thing as society, but there is no one thing that is society. There is no one thing that is literature. It is changing in many ways, and society is changing in many ways, and literature is changing in those ways as well. And again, those of you who have studied post-colonial thinkers like Edward Said or Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak or Homi K. Bhabha or people like that, who have studied these post-colonial thinkers, this is the kind of thing they were saying. That if you study post-colonial literature, you can't presume it's the same thing as studying a more traditionally studied literature. On the other hand, all those people also said, you have to close read, you have to bring those philological tools, those literary tools to what you're doing. And not only should you not abandon those tools are really going to help you renegotiate that ever-changing relation between literature and society. Many thanks for your time today, and I gave you my email address. And again, my thanks to Dr. Arjun and to the entire the Vedant organization for having me. And please do get in contact with me. I'd be very interested in how you react to what I said and how your specific conditions and where you are learning and teaching, how you are experiencing these issues in your context. So thank you again, and it's been a privilege to address you. Thank you.